a bizarre sacrifice. This was done out of human curiosity.
They found some that were buried under the flooring, mutilated bodies that were cut up.
A quest for medical knowledge, but to be performing it on live people? No, it goes way beyond that.
You might have heard about some really scary serial killers and crazy people who did awful things like hurting others on purpose and killing them for pleasure. But hold on tight, because what I'm about to tell you will shock you even more. It is the tale of the brutal abuse of black male slaves by Delphine LaLaurie. She might seem like a fancy lady from a long time ago, but her actions were beyond cruel, and trust me, it is so disturbing that you won't believe it. So, if you're eager to learn more about the terrible things she did, let's start uncovering them one by one. That was a fateful day of April 10, 1834, in the heart of the old French quarter of New Orleans. A huge fire ripped through a grand mansion, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. People from the neighborhood rushed over, concerned and curious about what was happening. But as the story goes, something strange was afoot. The woman who lived in the mansion, the one you'd expect to be directing the rescue efforts and safeguarding her home, seemed more interested in saving her precious jewels and fancy fur coats than helping her enslaved servants. As bystanders questioned her about the whereabouts of her servants, her response was both mysterious and odd. "Mind your own business," she shot back. Now, that surely raised some eyebrows, but what truly sent shivers down the spines of those present were the creepy sounds from the mansion's attic. In the midst of this confusion, a group of courageous individuals decided to take action. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the strange happenings in that mansion. But what the people who went inside discovered was a room of terror. A place where Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie carried out terrible acts. She's often put in the same league as some of history's most chilling characters, like Elizabeth Bathory, who is said to drink blood, and Lizzie Borden, who's linked to a story of giving her parents 40 deadly hits. In the stories that New Orleans tells, LaLaurie is known as the Savage Mistress. Her fame ignited not by virtuous acts, but by the chilling specter of her ruthless dominion over those in her charge. There was a person who found there a 70-year-old slave cook who was tied to the kitchen stove by LaLaurie, who started the fire that day. But that wasn't even the worst of her cruelty. The list of horrors that people claim the rescuers found in her attic is really hard to believe. It includes piles of bodies, organs, and body parts. There were slaves held down on tables or squeezed into small cages. Some were still alive, but their eyes were gouged, fingernails were ripped out, ears were hanging by bits of skin, and some even had their mouths filled with gross stuff and sewn shut. In that haunting place, they also came across others whose skin showed the cruel scars of pain, wounds that had turned nasty. There were even stories that tell of a woman whose skin was peeled off in twisted patterns, like a caterpillar's curves. Another poor soul had their bones broken and twisted to look like a crab shape. And then there was also someone whose intestines were torn out and tied around their waist. It's incredibly hard to even think about, but it's crucial to acknowledge that these terrible things actually happened. Now, if you're considering the possibility of some childhood trauma that she might have experienced, here's a look at the entirety of her life. Delphine LaLaurie was born in 1787 in a place called New Orleans, which was ruled by Spain back then. Her earlier life seemed normal, and she had led a fairly average and comfortable life. Although there were stories about slaves causing harm to her parents, the stories that happened to be untrue. She was part of the high society in New Orleans, and people really liked her because she seemed kind and polite. Delphine seemed like a beautiful flower on the outside, with her graceful style and elegant presence. But just like how some flowers can have sharp thorns hidden beneath their petals, Delphine's mansion held dark secrets that were well hidden behind her charming facade. She got married 3 times, and her third husband, Louis LaLaurie, was a younger doctor from France. They had a child together and got married after the child was born. But soon after that, people started hearing stories about how Delphine treated her slaves really badly. People complained, and there were investigations about her being cruel to her slaves in 1828, 1829, and 1832. While Delphine appeared kind to others, some believe she even harmed her own daughters when they tried to help the slaves. But there's more to consider. By the way, have you hit that subscribe button for more engaging crime secrets yet? If not, then what are you waiting for? Go ahead. Now, coming back to LaLaurie. It is being said that in 1771, her uncle was killed by slaves, which might have left her frightened. The Haitian Slave Revolt and Freedom Movement from 1971 to 1804 was another significant event she might have heard about. Also, there was a slave uprising in New Orleans in 1811. All these occurrences, combined with the idea that slave owners believed they needed to be very tough to prevent uprisings, could have played a role in pushing Delphine towards committing terrible acts. The punishments they used back then were really severe. During the 1811 revolt, more than 100 slaves were beheaded. Their heads were put on poles that stretched for 40 miles from the center of New Orleans out into the countryside. You could see the bodies of the rebel slaves hanging from the city gates. Not until 1833 did anyone bother to check on how LaLaurie treated her slaves. But that year, LaLaurie got really angry with a 12-year-old slave girl named Leah, because Leah accidentally pulled on a tangle while combing LaLaurie's hair, and this made LaLaurie very mad. She chased the girl with a whip, and the poor girl chose to jump off the roof rather than get beaten. But what was happening in the LaLaurie house was probably just seen as the usual punishments that came after the 1811 slave revolt. And then, in 1834, as we have told you, the big fire happened at the LaLaurie mansion. People were angry with LaLaurie because she didn't let her slaves out of the attic, and when they finally got inside, they stumbled upon some really nasty stuff. The newspaper back then wrote that 7 people were hanged by their necks and terribly hurt, while another story talked about a man with a hole in his head full of maggots. They had red marks from beatings, were eating thin soup, and had iron collars with spikes pointing inward around their necks. It sounds like something from a really old torture place, right? Believe it or not, these kinds of punishments were actually quite normal on farms around New Orleans. The people who owned the farms were afraid that their slaves would use their big knives to attack them while they sleep. They thought that unless they used a lot of violence, slaves wouldn't stay as slaves. But after knowing about all these happenings, a lot of people went to her house, broke in, and took everything they could while the fire was still burning. In the middle of all this chaos, she pulled off a daring escape with a person named Bastien. He was the one looking after the slaves. So they made a quick dash to the docks and hopped onto a boat bound for Paris. Well, some say she died there in 1842 or 1849, and her body was moved to a cemetery in New Orleans in 1851. But others think she faked her death in Paris and came back secretly to Louisiana to keep being cruel. Some even believe she never left at all. It's all a mystery. And if you want to uncover more such mysteries, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button.